Singapore's two Hondius passengers are hantavirus-free, and their quarantine ends June 6th. Meanwhile, WHO is on a live webinar asking a very simple question. Did any country's border health system actually catch everyone before they got that far?
This is Hantavirus Watch. I'm Brian, Cassidy's here, and today we finally get to find out whether the IHR framework performed is a real answer or just a press release sentence.
We've got the WHO EPI-WIN session live at 1300 CEST. Singapore's quarantine exit is now 2 days away, and Europe just moved on favipiravir. Those are 3 concrete things we can hold institutions to.
And if you're a Hondius passenger in France, Spain, or the Netherlands right now, there's a drug on the way to your country, with 0 published criteria for who gets it. We're going to push on that.
CDC writes,
CDC, in coordination with state and federal partners, repatriated 18 people who were potentially exposed to hantavirus on the MV Hondius cruise ship in May 2026. They were flown to the Nebraska Quarantine Unit, NQU, at the University of Nebraska Medical Center for a 42-day public health monitoring period.
CDC's June 2 situation page is the standing record now. Andes virus confirmed. 18 people repatriated to the Nebraska Quarantine Unit, and 0 U.S. confirmed cases from this outbreak. That last phrase matters. As a result of this outbreak is hedged language. And it's still hedged language today.
And while CDC is holding that line on the U.S. side, the European Commission just sent favipiravir to France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the 3 countries where Hondius cases are confirmed enough to justify emergency drug shipment. So what's the equivalent for a symptomatic NQU patient? Does CDC's page say anything about experimental treatment access, or does it just say monitor for symptoms?
To be precise, EMA flagged favipiravir as a compassionate use or clinical trial candidate, not an approved therapy. That's a meaningful distinction. It's moving through regulatory channels in Europe, but dispatched does not mean prescribed and proven.
Fair, but those 3 countries now have a named drug in hand, so presumably they also have criteria for who gets it. If you're a Hondius passenger under home monitoring in Rotterdam right now and you spike a fever, what do you actually do? That pathway has to be on paper somewhere, and I haven't seen it named.
This one's from World Health Organization.
The complex multi-country response to the hantavirus outbreak linked to cruise ship travel is an unprecedented test of the global border health system. This public health event has triggered an internationally coordinated multi-sectoral response involving multiple countries across the globe. The WHO Secretariat, conveyance operators, and partners in the public health, travel, transport, or foreign affairs, to name a few.
The WHO EPI-WIN webinar is live right now, 13 to 1400 CE100 ST, and the framing matters. WHO is calling this a quintessential border health event and pointing straight at parts 5 and 6 of the IHR, which cover points of entry, affected conveyances, and health documents. That's WHO saying this is a stress test of the IHR framework itself.
Yesterday I asked whether this webinar would actually answer one question. Did any country get a complete passenger manifest through the NFP network, or did they start from scratch? The session description calls the multi-country response unprecedented, which is not the same thing as saying it worked. So did the NFP network close the tracing gap, or not?
What I can pin down from the WHO notice is this. As of May 21st, there were 13 confirmed cases, 3 deaths, and Andes virus. That's the standing record, and it matches the CDC June 2nd situation page. WHO still has the global population risk at low, and the NFP network is described as active for international contact tracing. This webinar is the first named WHO session where that network's actual performance gets examined in real time.
The phrase information sharing for international contact tracing purposes through the NFP network is doing a lot of work there. Information sharing is not the same as complete manifests received and verified. I need criteria, not process descriptions.
The Straits Times writes,
2 Singapore residents who were on board a hantavirus-hit cruise ship continue to test negative for the disease and have been allowed to continue their quarantine at home until June 6th should they choose to do so.
On the monitoring thread, Singapore's 2 Hondius residents are still negative and finishing their last 12 days at home, with a hard end date of June 6th. Their most recent Andes strain tests came back clean on May 22nd, and Singapore's CDA confirmed that. That's a named agency, a named date, and a named endpoint, which is more than most countries have put on the record.
Their last exposure was April 25 on a flight with a confirmed case from St. Helena to Johannesburg. Singapore counted from that date, did facility quarantine, then moved them home on May 25 with 12 days still left. That's an actual protocol with actual dates. Oregon Health Authority is still just monitoring a returning passenger with no named endpoint. How hard is it to publish a June 6?
To be precise, the 42-day window isn't arbitrary. It covers the outer bound of expected symptom onset for Andes hantavirus. Singapore is running right out to that outer bound. If these two men clear June 6 with no symptoms, that's the first complete, documented quarantine arc in this outbreak, with a sourced endpoint.
Once passengers from a ship like the Hondius scatter across a dozen countries, how do health officials even start figuring out who was actually exposed and who's just a worried tourist who happened to be nearby?
It's a genuinely hard problem, and the Hondius case made it harder because the clock was already running before anyone knew there was a clock. Per WHO's disease outbreak news from May 8th, by the time the cluster was flagged, 34 passengers and crew had already left the ship, and the AP reported that more than 24 of them disembarked on the remote island of St. Helena on April 24th, nearly 2 weeks after the first passenger had died, with no contact tracing in place. So the first problem is just locating people. Health authorities on at least 4 continents were actively tracking those passengers down, and not everyone on board counts the same way for exposure purposes. The key biological fact shaping all of this, highlighted by both the ECDC and CBC News, is that Andes virus, unlike most hantaviruses, has documented potential for human-to-human transmission. That's exactly why officials can't just say, you got it from a rodent or you didn't. It changes who counts as a contact. Not only people who might have touched contaminated surfaces, but close contacts of confirmed cases too. Cabin mates, dining companions, family members who traveled together. Then the coordination becomes a relay. The ship operator's passenger manifest goes to national health authorities in each passenger's home country, and those agencies take over monitoring from there.
So if Andes virus can spread person to person, does that mean the contacts of contacts, the people those passengers went home to, also need to be tracked?
That's the question driving the urgency here. NPR's reporting on the contact tracing effort says the goal isn't just getting to the passengers themselves, it's monitoring the health of the people they've since interacted with, precisely because of that human-to-human transmission question. For American passengers specifically, 17 were expected to return through the Canary Islands and head to Nebraska for dedicated monitoring, which tells you officials are treating this as more than a call your doctor if you feel sick situation. The thing to watch next is whether any secondary cases show up in household contacts. That would be the clearest signal yet about how efficiently this Andes strain cluster transmits beyond the ship itself. This one's from Dev Discourse.
Favipiravir, an experimental antiviral targeting hantavirus, is reaching France, Spain, and the Netherlands in its first deliveries, according to an announcement by the European Commission Thursday. With no current approved treatment for hantavirus, the European Medicines Agency has highlighted favipiravir as a promising option for clinical trials or compassionate use.
The European Commission dispatched favipiravir to France, Spain, and the Netherlands today, and the EMA's framing matters here. This is a clinical trial or compassionate use candidate, not an approved therapy. Those are 2 different regulatory lanes, and the story doesn't say which one these shipments are actually traveling under.
France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Those are 3 of the countries with confirmed Hondius cases. So Europe has an experimental drug moving to exactly the right addresses. What I don't see is the pathway. If you're a Hondius passenger under home monitoring in Lyon right now, and you spike a fever, who do you call to get access to this?
And the U.S. comparison makes that sharper. CDC's situation page names 18 repatriations to Nebraska and no confirmed U.S. cases, but there's no equivalent named treatment pathway. Favipiravir moving through European regulatory channels is the first concrete antiviral action in this outbreak. What NQU patients had access to experimentally is still an open question. If Hantavirus Watch is part of your daily risk radar, try Anthropic Pentagon Watch, a daily briefing on Anthropic's fight with the DoD over Claude, military AI use, autonomous weapons, and AI procurement blacklisting. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts. You'll find links to every story we covered today in the show notes, so if one caught your attention, you can follow it there and read more. That's Hantavirus Watch for this Thursday, June 4th. This is a Lantern podcast.